In the bitter Colorado winter of 1887, a father's cruelty reached its peak when drunken rancher James May lined up his daughters like livestock at auction. "Which of my girls would you like?" he slurred to the jeering crowd, when scarred mountain man Noel Boon stepped forward and declared, "I want the fat one," pointing at Susan May. The town fell silent. What happened next would shatter everything they thought they knew about worth, dignity, and love. Stay with me until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind howled through the streets of Cedar Falls like a banshee, carrying with it the bitter promise of another harsh Colorado winter. Snow crunched under heavy boots as the townspeople gathered in the amber glow of the saloon's windows, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. It was Saturday night, and Saturday nights in Cedar Falls meant one thing: trouble was brewing at Murphy's Saloon. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the acrid smell of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. Oil lamps flickered against the rough-hewn walls, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the revelry below. The piano player, a thin man with yellowed teeth, pounded out a raucous tune while miners, railroad workers, and ranchers alike drowned their sorrows in whiskey that burned like liquid fire. At the center of it all stood James May, swaying like a tree in a storm, his weathered face flushed red from drink and the heat of the crowded room. His gray hair hung in greasy strands around his shoulders, and his clothes reeked of horses and desperation. In his gnarled hand, he clutched a bottle of rot-gut whiskey, taking swigs between his boisterous proclamations. "Gentlemen," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the din like a rusty blade, "gather round and witness something special tonight. Old James May is gonna solve all his problems." The crowd turned toward him with the lazy interest of men who had nothing better to do than watch another man's misery unfold. They formed a rough circle around him, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames of the oil lamps. "What you got in mind, May?" called out Silas Garrett, the town's blacksmith, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks. "You finally gonna pay your debts?" A chorus of laughter erupted from the crowd. James May's debts were legendary in Cedar Falls, money owed to the general store, the bank fellow ranchers, and half the businesses in town. His ranch, once prosperous, had fallen into ruin after his wife's death 3 years prior, leaving him to raise 5 daughters alone while slowly drinking himself into poverty. "Better than that," James shouted, raising his bottle high. "I'm gonna give you boys a chance at something money can't buy. I'm gonna let one of you lucky bastards choose himself a wife from my own flesh and blood." The laughter died instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to press against the walls. Even the piano player's fingers stumbled on the keys before falling still. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the pot-bellied stove and the whistle of wind through the gaps in the building. "Now hold on there, May," said Doc Henderson, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. "You can't be serious about dead serious." James interrupted, his eyes wild with the kind of desperation that comes from a man with nothing left to lose. "My girls are all of marrying age, and I ain't got the means to feed 'em through another winter. Hell, I can barely feed myself." He took another long pull from his bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "So here's what I'm proposing. Any man with $50 cash and a willingness to take on a wife can have his pick. Consider it a dowry in reverse." The crowd exchanged uncertain glances. They'd seen James May at his lowest before, but this was something else entirely. This was a man selling his own daughters like cattle at market. "Where are these daughters of yours?" asked Tom Bradley, a young railroad worker with more money than sense. "We ain't gonna take your word for it." James May's grin was ugly and predatory. "Right outside, boy. Been waiting in the cold while I warmed up the crowd." He turned toward the door and shouted, "Girls, get yourselves in here. Time to meet your potential husbands." The saloon doors swung open, and 5 young women filed in, their faces pale from cold and something else, shame perhaps, or fear. They ranged in age from 16 to 24, and each carried herself differently as they lined up against the wall like prisoners awaiting judgment. The eldest, Margaret, stood tall and defiant despite the circumstances. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely and her green eyes blazed with anger. She was considered the beauty of the family, with delicate features and a figure that had caught the eye of many a young man in town. Next to her stood Patricia, 22 years old, with soft brown hair and gentle blue eyes. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Patricia had always been the quiet one, the peacemaker, who tried to smooth over her father's rough edges. The middle daughter, Susan, was 20 years old and stood apart from her sisters in more ways than one. Where they were willowy and delicate, she was substantial not just in frame, but in presence. Her dark brown hair fell in thick waves around her round face, and her hazel eyes held a sadness that seemed to run bone deep. The townspeople had always been cruel about Susan's size, calling her the fat May girl behind her hands, and sometimes to her face. The two youngest, Catherine and Mary, were barely more than children at 16 and 18 respectively. Catherine had inherited her mother's golden hair and blue eyes, while Mary possessed the same dark coloring as Susan, but with a slender build that promised beauty to come. The men in the saloon looked the girls over like they were examining horses for purchase, and Susan felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She'd known this day might come. Her father had threatened it often enough when he was deep into his cups, but she'd never truly believed he'd go through with it. "Well, well," James said, his voice dripping with false pride. "Feast your eyes, gentlemen. 5 fine specimens of womanhood, each one trained in all the domestic arts. They can cook, clean, sew, and tend to animals. Margaret here can even read and write, thanks to her sainted mother's teaching." Margaret's jaw clenched at the mention of their mother, and Susan saw her sister's hands ball into fists at her sides. If looks could kill, their father would have been struck dead on the spot. "Now I know what you're thinking," James continued, oblivious to his daughter's rage. "How can old James May bear to part with such treasures? Well, the truth is a man's got to be practical. Winter's coming and these girls eat like horses, well, some more than others." His eyes lingered cruelly on Susan, and several men in the crowd snickered. Susan felt her stomach clench with familiar shame. All her life she'd been the target of her father's cruelest remarks, the one he blamed for her mother's difficult labor, the one who never seemed to measure up to her prettier, thinner sisters. Standing there in front of the leering crowd, she wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. "So what do you say, boys?" James spread his arms wide. "Who wants to take home a bride tonight?" Tom Bradley stepped forward first, his young face eager. "I'll take the pretty one, Margaret there. Got my $50 right here." He pulled a wad of bills from his pocket and waved them in the air. "Sold," James cried before Margaret could protest. "Tom Bradley, you just bought yourself the finest woman in 3 counties. Margaret's face went white as a sheet. "I won't do it," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "You'll do as you're told, girl." James snapped, his jovial mask slipping for a moment to reveal the ugly anger beneath. "You're my daughter, and you'll obey me." "I'm 24 years old," Margaret shot back, finding her voice. "I'm not a child, and I'm not property to be sold." The crowd grew uncomfortable again, shifting from foot to foot as they watched the family drama unfold. This wasn't entertainment anymore, it was something darker, more desperate. "The law says different," James replied coldly. "You're unmarried and living under my roof, which makes you my responsibility and my decision. Tom Bradley's got his money ready, and that makes you Mrs. Bradley as of tonight." Before Margaret could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "I'll take the blonde one, Catherine." It was Bill Hutchins, a grizzled miner with more gold dust than good sense. "Sweet little thing like that deserves better than this place." Catherine let out a small sob and moved closer to Mary, who wrapped her arms protectively around her younger sister. At 18 and 16, they were still babies in many ways, and the horror of the situation was only beginning to sink in. "No," Mary said firmly, her young voice carrying surprising strength. "Catherine's too young. This is wrong, Papa. All of this is wrong." James May's face darkened like a storm cloud. "Don't you dare tell me what's right and wrong, you ungrateful little whelp. I've fed you and clothed you for 18 years, and this is how you repay me with defiance." The argument was interrupted by a commotion near the door. The crowd parted as a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, and walking with the measured gait of a man who was comfortable with violence. It was Noel Boon, and his arrival changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Noel Boon was a legend in Cedar Falls, though not always a welcome one. He lived alone in a cabin high up in the mountains, coming down to town only when he needed supplies, or when someone was desperate enough to seek his help. Scars crisscrossed his weathered face, souvenirs from his days as a cavalry scout during the Indian Wars, and his dark eyes held secrets that most men were afraid to know. He was older than most of the men in the saloon, probably pushing 40, with silver threading through his black hair and beard. His clothes were rough but well-made, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced death and lived to tell about it. "Heard there was some kind of auction going on," Noel said, his voice low and gravelly. "Came to see what all the fuss was about." The crowd made way for him, and Susan felt her breath catch in her throat. She'd seen Noel Boon in town before, always from a distance, and he'd always struck her as someone who belonged more to the wilderness than to civilization. There was something wild about him, something untamed, that made her pulse quicken in ways she didn't understand. James May's eyes lit up with greed. "Noel Boon, didn't expect to see you down from your mountain tonight. You interested in acquiring some feminine companionship?" Noel's gaze swept over the five sisters, taking in their fear, their shame, their desperate situation. His expression remained unreadable, but Susan thought she saw something flicker in his dark eyes, anger perhaps, or disgust. "Depends," Noel said finally. "What are the terms? $50 and a willingness to marry," James replied eagerly. "Each girl comes with whatever skills her mother taught her, plus whatever dowry items I can spare. It's a bargain at twice the price." Noel nodded slowly, as if considering the offer. The entire saloon held its breath, waiting to see what the mysterious mountain man would do. Susan found herself staring at him, trying to read his intentions in the hard lines of his face. "Which one would you recommend?" Noel asked, and James May's grin widened. "Well, now that depends on what you're looking for. Margaret's the beauty, smart as a whip and bred for better things. Patricia's gentle and biddable, perfect for a man who wants peace in his home. The young ones, Catherine and Mary, they've got potential, but need some growing up to do." Noel's gaze lingered on each sister in turn, and Susan felt her heart sink as she realized he wasn't even considering her. Why would he? She was the fat one, the one nobody wanted, the one who would be left behind when all was said and done. "What about that one?" Noel asked, and Susan was shocked to realize he was pointing directly at her. The saloon erupted in laughter, and James May's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Susan Hell Boon, I was saving the best for last. Sure, she's got some meat on her bones, but that just means she can work harder and won't blow away in a strong wind. She's strong as an ox and twice as useful." The cruel laughter cut through Susan like a knife, and she felt tears sting her eyes. Even in this degrading situation, she was still the object of mockery, still the one people couldn't take seriously. But Noel Boon wasn't laughing. His dark eyes were fixed on her face, studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks burn. "How old is she?" 20, James replied, still chuckling. "Prime breeding age, if you catch my meaning. And she's got a practical nature, won't spend all your money on fripperies and nonsense. Can she cook? Like a dream. Her mother taught her everything she knew before she passed. Can she tend to injuries? Sickness?" James nodded eagerly. "She's got healing hands, that one. Helped birth half the foals on my ranch and doctored plenty of sick animals besides." Noel was quiet for a long moment. his gaze never leaving Susan's face. She wanted to look away to hide from his scrutiny, but something in his eyes held her captive. There was no mockery there, no cruelty, just a careful assessment that made her feel more seen than she had in years. Finally he spoke, and his words fell into the silence like stones into a still pond. "I want the fat one." The laughter died instantly, replaced by stunned silence. Susan felt the world tilt around her as if the floor had suddenly become unsteady beneath her feet. Had she heard him correctly? Had Noel Boon, legendary mountain man, war hero, the most mysterious figure in 3 counties, actually chosen her? James May's mouth fell open in shock. You want Susan? Are you sure? I mean, Margaret's still available, and she's—" "I said what I said," Noel interrupted, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, counting out $50 in gold coins and placing them on the nearest table. "That's my payment. Now, if the lady is willing, I'd like to take her home." All eyes turned to Susan, who stood frozen in place, unable to process what was happening. Home. He wanted to take her home. After a lifetime of being the one nobody wanted, the one people laughed at, someone had actually chosen her. "Well, girl," James May demanded, his voice sharp with impatience. "The man's paid good money for you. What's your answer?" Susan opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight, and her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Around her, the crowd waited with bated breath, eager to see how this strange drama would unfold. Margaret stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Susan doesn't have to do anything she doesn't want to do. None of us do. This whole thing is barbaric and probably illegal." "It's perfectly legal," Tom Bradley protested, clutching his money. "A father has the right to arrange marriages for his daughters, especially when they're living under his roof." "Arranged marriages are one thing," Margaret shot back. "This is an auction. You're treating us like livestock." The argument erupted again, voices rising as different factions formed within the crowd. Some supported Margaret's position, horrified by the spectacle they were witnessing. Others, particularly those who had already placed their bids, insisted that the transactions were binding. Through it all, Noel Boon remained silent, his eyes still fixed on Susan's face. Finally, he took a step toward her, moving slowly and carefully, as if she were a skittish animal that might bolt at any moment. "Miss May," he said quietly, his voice somehow cutting through the noise around them. "I know this isn't how any woman dreams of meeting her husband. I know you don't know me from Adam, and you've got every right to be scared. But I'm asking you to come with me, not because your father says so, but because you choose to." Susan found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why me?" The simple question seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because," he said finally, "I've been watching this whole sorry spectacle, and you're the only one in this room who looks like she understands what real suffering is. I figure that makes you stronger than the rest." It wasn't the romantic declaration that young girls dreamed about, but somehow it meant more to Susan than any flowery words could have. He saw her strength. In a room full of people who only saw her weaknesses, her flaws, her differences, this scarred stranger saw something worth choosing. "What kind of life would I have with you?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "An honest one," he replied without hesitation. "Hard work, simple pleasures, and no promises, except that I'll treat you with respect and never raise a hand to you in anger. I can't offer you luxury or society, but I can offer you a place where you'll be valued for who you are, not mocked for what you aren't." The crowd had fallen silent again, drawn in despite themselves by the quiet intensity of the exchange. Even James May seemed to sense that something significant was happening, something that went beyond his crude attempt at solving his financial problems. Susan looked around the room at the faces surrounding her, some curious, some disgusted, some leering with cruel amusement. Her gaze lingered on her sisters, particularly Margaret, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. "If I go with you," Susan said slowly. What happens to them? Noel followed her gaze to her sisters, understanding immediately what she was asking. That's their choice to make, same as yours. I've got enough money to buy all 5 of you if that's what it takes, but I won't force any woman to come with me who doesn't want to. You'd do that? Susan asked, her voice filled with wonder. You'd buy them all just to set them free? I've seen enough slavery in my time, Noel replied grimly. I won't be party to more of it, even the legal kind. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to drowning sailors. Margaret stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. I'll work to pay you back every penny. I won't be bought and sold like a sack of grain. Neither will I, Patricia added quietly, moving to stand beside her older sister. The younger girls nodded their agreement, and for the first time since entering the saloon, they looked like they had hope again. But James May wasn't about to let his payday slip away so easily. Now hold on just a minute, he roared, swaying dangerously as the whiskey finally caught up with him. These are my daughters, and I say who they marry and when. You can have Susan if you want her, but the others are spoken for, like hell they are. Margaret snapped, her temper finally boiling over. I wouldn't marry Tom Bradley if he was the last man on earth. You'll marry who I tell you to marry, James shouted back, raising his hand as if to strike her. The blow never landed. Noel Boon moved with startling speed for such a large man, catching James May's wrist in a grip that made the older man cry out in pain. I don't think so, Noel said, his voice deadly quiet. In fact, I think this whole auction is over. The confrontation might have escalated further, but at that moment the saloon doors burst open again, admitting a blast of cold air and 3 figures that made everyone freeze in place. Sheriff Coleman stood in the doorway, flanked by Judge Morrison and Father McKenna, the Catholic priest who served the growing Irish population in Cedar Falls. All 3 men looked grim, and their arrival sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. What's going on here? Sheriff Coleman demanded, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. We got reports of some kind of disturbance. James May tried to straighten up, smoothing down his greasy hair and attempting to look respectable. No disturbance, Sheriff, just a little family business, that's all. Judge Morrison's eyes swept over the 5 sisters, taking in their frightened faces in obvious distress. What kind of family business requires half the town to crowd into a saloon at 10 o'clock at night? Before James could answer, Margaret stepped forward. He's trying to sell us, Your Honor, like we're animals at market. The judge's face darkened. Is this true, May? It's perfectly legal, James protested, his voice rising with desperation. A father has the right to arrange marriages for his daughters. Ask any lawyer. Arranged marriages are indeed legal, Judge Morrison agreed coldly. But what you're describing sounds more like slavery with extra steps. Father McKenna, what's the church's position on this? The priest, a thin man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, looked disgusted. The church recognizes marriages based on mutual consent and love, not financial transactions. What Mr. May is proposing is an abomination in the eyes of God. Sheriff Coleman nodded grimly. That settles it. This gathering is hereby disbanded. Everyone go home, and if I hear about any more auctions involving human beings, there'll be arrests made. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, muttering among themselves as they filed out into the cold night. Tom Bradley tried to protest, waving his money in the air, but one look from the sheriff sent him scurrying for the door. Soon only the May family, Noel Boon, and the 3 officials remained in the suddenly quiet saloon. Now then, Judge Morrison said, his voice more gentle as he addressed the sisters, I want each of you to tell me honestly and without fear whether you consent to any marriage arrangements your father has made tonight. Margaret spoke first, her voice clear and strong. I do not consent to marry Tom Bradley or anyone else my father chooses for me. Nor do I consent to any arrangement, Patricia added. Catherine and Mary voiced similar refusals, their young voices shaking but determined. All eyes turned to Susan, who stood apart from her sisters, her mind racing. Noel Boon hadn't moved during the official intervention, hadn't tried to claim his purchase or demand his money back. He simply stood quietly waiting for her decision. "Miss Susan," Judge Morrison prompted gently, "what about you?" Susan looked at Noel, studying his scarred face in the flickering lamplight. There was something in his expression, not expectation or demand, but patient acceptance of whatever she decided. He wasn't trying to pressure her or claim ownership over her. He was simply waiting. "Mr. Boon," she said slowly, "your offer to take me home, was that a marriage proposal?" "It was," he replied simply. "Not the kind you deserve, maybe, but the only kind I know how to make. And if I say no, then you say no, and I wish you well." Susan felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever given her a choice before, not about anything important. Her father had always made decisions for her, her sisters had always spoken for her, and the world had always told her what she could and couldn't expect from life. But here was this strange, scarred man offering her something she'd never had before, the power to choose her own fate. "I need to think," she said finally. "Can you give me until morning?" Noel nodded. "I'll be camped outside town. If you decide you want to come with me, meet me at sunrise by the old oak tree on the north road. If you don't come, I'll understand." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Miss May, whatever you decide, don't let anyone tell you you're not worth choosing. Any man would be lucky to have you." With that, he walked out into the night, leaving Susan staring after him with her heart pounding and her mind reeling with possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of heated arguments, tears, and desperate planning. Judge Morrison escorted the sisters back to their father's ranch, warning James May that any attempt to force his daughters into unwanted marriages would result in serious legal consequences. Back at the ranch house, a modest building that had seen better days, the sisters huddled together in the room Margaret and Patricia shared, trying to figure out what to do next. "We could go to Denver," Margaret suggested, pacing back and forth across the small space. "I could find work as a governess or a teacher. Patricia could do seam work." "With what money?" Patricia asked practically. "We don't have enough for train fare, let alone setting up new lives." "We could ask for help from the church," Catherine offered. Father McKenna seemed sympathetic. "Charity," Mary said bitterly. "That's all, we'd be objects of pity passed from hand to hand." Through it all, Susan sat quietly on the edge of the bed, her mind turning over Noel Boon's words. Any man would be lucky to have you. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. She was used to being the one people settled for, the one who was better than nothing. But Noel Boon hadn't acted like he was settling. He'd acted like he was choosing deliberately, thoughtfully, for reasons that had nothing to do with desperation or convenience. "Susan," Margaret's voice broke through her reverie. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Susan looked up to find all four of her sisters staring at her with varying degrees of concern and curiosity. "Mr. Boon's offer," she said honestly. "I'm thinking about accepting it." The room erupted in protest. "Susan, you can't be serious," Margaret exclaimed. "You don't know anything about him. He could be dangerous." "He could be a killer," Patricia added. "He's got those scars, and everyone says he did terrible things during the war." "He's old enough to be your father," Catherine chimed in, "and he lives all alone up in the mountains like some kind of hermit," Mary finished. Susan listened to their objections, patiently understanding their concern, but feeling strangely calm about her potential decision. "Maybe all of that's true," she said when they finished, "but he's also the only person who's ever chosen me for myself. Not because he had to, not because he felt sorry for me, but because he wanted to." "That's not true," Margaret protested. "Lots of people care about you." "Do they?" Susan asked quietly. "Or do they care about the person they think I should be? Margaret, you're beautiful and smart. Patricia, you're gentle and kind. Catherine and Mary, you're young and full of potential, but me, I'm just Susan, the fat one, the one who takes up too much space and eats too much food, and will never be pretty enough or small enough or good enough for anyone to really want. Her sisters fell silent, unable to deny the painful truth in her words. They'd all seen how the world treated Susan, how their own father talked about her, how the townspeople looked at her with barely concealed disgust or pity. But Mr. Boon, Susan continued, her voice growing stronger, he looked at me like I was someone worth having, not in spite of who I am, but because of it. He said he thought I was strong. When's the last time anyone called me strong instead of stubborn, or determined instead of difficult? Margaret sat down beside her, taking her hand. Susan, I understand the appeal, but marriage is forever. What if he turns out to be cruel? What if he changes his mind once he gets you up there alone? What if he doesn't? Susan countered, but what if this is my chance at a real life with someone who actually values me? I'm 20 years old, Margaret. How many more chances do you think I'm going to get? The question hung heavy in the air. They all knew the answer, even if none of them wanted to say it out loud. In a small town like Cedar Falls, Susan's reputation as the fat May girl was set in stone. Any local man who might consider marrying her would be doing so out of pity or desperation, and she'd spend the rest of her life knowing it. If you're really considering this, Patricia said slowly, then we need to know more about him, Ma. Has anyone actually talked to someone who knows Noel Boon, really knows him, not just gossip and speculation? Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Doc Henderson treated his injuries when he first came to town after the war, and I heard Sheriff Coleman mention once that they served together. Then that's where we start, Susan said, surprising herself with her decisiveness. If I'm going to make this choice, I'm going to make it with as much information as possible. The sisters spent the rest of the night planning, and by morning they had a strategy. While Susan wrestled with her decision, Margaret and Patricia would discreetly gather information about Noel Boon from people who actually knew him. As dawn approached, Susan found herself standing at her bedroom window, looking out toward the mountains where somewhere a scarred stranger was waiting for her answer. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky pink and gold, and she knew that in a few hours she'd have to decide whether to walk toward the oak tree on the north road or stay safely in the life she'd always known. It wasn't really much of a choice when she thought about it. Stay and remain the unwanted daughter, the burden, the one who would spend her life grateful for scraps of affection and tolerance. Or go and risk everything on the slim chance that someone might actually want her for who she was. For the first time in her life, Susan May was about to choose her own destiny. And as the sun rose over the Colorado mountains, she began to get dressed for what might be the most important walk of her life. The choice was hers to make, and for better or worse, she was finally ready to make it. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows as Susan made her way quietly through the house, her sister's research from the night before weighing heavily on her mind. Margaret and Patricia had returned near midnight with information that painted a picture far different from the wild rumors that circulated through town. Doc Henderson had been surprisingly forthcoming when Patricia approached him at his clinic. Noel Boon, the doctor had said, adjusting his spectacles thoughtfully. Finest man I've ever had the privilege to treat. Came to me half dead after wounded knee, more scars on his body than I'd ever seen on a living soul, but never once complained, never asked for laudanum, even when the pain was clearly unbearable. And when old Mrs. Patterson's grandson took sick with pneumonia, last winter Boone rode through a blizzard to fetch me, then stayed 3 days helping nurse the boy back to health, never asked for payment, never wanted recognition. That's the measure of a man, if you ask me. Sheriff Coleman had been equally revealing when Margaret encountered him making his rounds. Noel and I served together in the Dakota Territory. He'd told her, his weathered face growing serious. Saved my life more times than I can count. When we mustered out, most of the boys went wild, drinking, gambling, chasing women. But Noel just wanted peace. Said he'd seen enough violence to last 10 lifetimes. He's never caused trouble in my town, pays his debts, and keeps to himself. If he's made an offer of marriage to your sister, she could do a hell of a lot worse. Even Father McKenna, when approached delicately by Catherine, had spoken well of the mountain man. He's not a regular churchgoer, the priest had admitted, but he's contributed anonymously to our poor fund more than once. Last Christmas he left a sack of gold coins at the church door with a note asking that we use it to help families in need. A man's relationship with God is between him and the Almighty, but I judge him by his works, and his works show a good heart. Now, as Susan gathered her few possessions into a worn carpet bag, she felt a strange mixture of terror and anticipation. The oak tree stood perhaps a mile from the ranch, and she could see its massive silhouette against the lightening sky. Would he be there? Would he have changed his mind in the cold light of dawn? Her sisters had all pretended to sleep when she'd risen, but she could feel their watchful eyes following her movements. Margaret had left a small bundle on the dresser, a few coins saved from household money, an ivory comb that had belonged to their mother, and a letter of reference attesting to Susan's character and skills. Just in case, the note said, in Margaret's careful handwriting. Susan tucked the bundle into her bag alongside her 2 spare dresses, her mother's Bible and the small wooden horse their father had carved for her 10th birthday, back when he'd still been capable of such gestures. It wasn't much to show for 20 years of life, but it represented everything she truly owned in the world. The kitchen was cold and dark as she passed through it, but she paused to light a single candle and write a brief note of her own. Dear sisters, by the time you read this, I will have made my choice. Please don't think less of me for it. I go not because I'm running away, but because I'm finally running towards something. Take care of each other and remember that just because I'm choosing a different path doesn't mean I love you any less. Your devoted sister, Susan. She left the note propped against the coffee pot, knowing Margaret would find it when she came down to start breakfast. Then, before she could lose her nerve, she wrapped her mother's old shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The walk to the oak tree felt both endless and far too short. With each step, Susan's mind churned with doubts and possibilities. What if this was all some elaborate joke? What if Noel Boon was waiting there with half the town ready to humiliate her one final time? What if he'd simply changed his mind? But as she crested the small hill that overlooked the meeting spot, she saw him there, a tall, solid figure, standing beneath the ancient tree, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He wasn't alone. A sturdy horse stood nearby, saddled and ready for travel, with what appeared to be supplies packed behind the saddle. Noel turned as he heard her approach, and Susan was struck again by how different he looked from the men she was used to. Where her father and his friends were soft with drink and dissolution, Noel was all lean muscle and controlled strength. His scars didn't make him hideous, as some claimed. They simply marked him as a survivor, someone who had faced terrible things and endured. "Miss May," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither was I," Susan admitted, stopping a few feet away from him. Up close, she could see that his dark eyes were kind despite their intensity, and his mouth, what she could see of it beneath his beard, looked more inclined to gentleness than cruelty. "You have questions," he said, and it wasn't a question. "That's wise. A woman should know what she's getting into." Susan nodded, setting down her carpet bag and wrapping her shawl more tightly around herself. "My sisters found out some things about you, good things," she added quickly when she saw his expression tighten. "But I need to hear from you directly. Why do you want a wife, and why me?" Noel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he seemed to consider how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and honest. "I've been alone for a long time, Miss May. After the war, I thought I preferred it that way. Figured I'd seen too much done, too much to be fit for decent company. But loneliness has a way of eating at a man, and I'm tired of talking only to my horse and the wind." He paused, then continued. As for why I watched you in that saloon last night, watched how you stood there with dignity while your father tried to sell you like livestock, watched how you worried about your sisters instead of yourself. Most people would have broken under that kind of humiliation, but you didn't. You stayed strong. That's the kind of woman I need, someone who won't crumble when life gets hard. Life with you will be hard, Susan asked, and he appreciated that she didn't try to pretty up the question. Mountain living always is. The cabin's sound, but it's small and simple. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and town's a half-day ride in good weather. Winters are long and harsh, and there's always work to be done, tending animals, preserving food, maintaining equipment. It's not a life for someone who needs luxury or constant company. Susan considered this. She'd never known luxury anyway, and constant company had mostly meant constant criticism. What about other things, marital duties? Noel's weathered cheeks actually reddened slightly at the delicate question. I won't lie to you, Miss May. I'm a man with a man's needs, and if you become my wife, I'll hope for children someday. But I'll never force myself on you, and I'll give you time to get comfortable with me first. That's a promise. The honesty in his voice was reassuring, and Susan found herself relaxing slightly. What if it doesn't work? What if we can't make each other happy? Then we'll deal with that when it comes, but I'm hoping we won't have to. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his dark eyes. I can't promise you romance like in those books women read. I'm not a young man and I've got more scars than pretty words, but I can promise you respect, partnership, and a home where you'll be valued for who you are, not mocked for what you're not. It was perhaps the most honest proposal any woman had ever received, lacking in poetry but rich in truth. Susan felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness that she'd never experienced before. There's something else, she said, her voice growing stronger. My father, he'll try to stop this. He'll say you're taking his property, or that the agreement isn't binding because the sheriff interrupted it. Noel's expression hardened. Your father can say whatever he likes. We're going to see Judge Morrison this morning and get properly married before we head up the mountain. Legal and binding with witnesses and everything signed proper. No one will be able to claim otherwise. The practicality of the arrangement was somehow more romantic than any flowery declaration could have been. He'd thought this through, planned for contingencies, made sure she'd be protected. When was the last time anyone had taken such care to protect her interests? Judge Morrison will marry us, Susan asked. Even after what happened last night? I sent word to him an hour ago. He's agreed to perform the ceremony at 9 o'clock, assuming you're willing. Noel paused, then added quietly, but that's entirely up to you, Miss May. Even now, even after coming this far, you can still change your mind. I'll escort you back to your family's ranch and tip my hat and ride away, no hard feelings. Susan looked back toward the ranch house, barely visible in the distance. She could return to her small room. Her father's cruel words, her role as the unwanted daughter who ate too much and cost too much and would never be good enough. She could spend the rest of her life grateful for scraps of affection and acceptance. Or she could take the biggest risk of her life and trust this scarred stranger who looked at her like she was worth something. Mr. Boon, she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was pounding. I accept your proposal. Something that might have been relief flickered across his features. Then I guess you'd better start calling me Noel. The ride to town was unlike anything Susan had ever experienced. She'd ridden horses before, but never behind a man, never with her arms around someone's waist as they navigated the rough trails. Noel's horse was a big, steady gelding named Thunder, and he seemed to sense his rider's nervousness, picking his way carefully over the rocky ground. Tell me about your cabin, Susan said as they rode, trying to distract herself from the magnitude of what she was about to do. It's nothing fancy, Noel replied, his voice carrying easily, despite the wind. 2 rooms, a main room with the fireplace and kitchen area, and a smaller room for sleeping. There's a good well, a stable for the animals, and a root cellar for storing food. I built it myself after I came back from the war, so it's solid, meant to last. What animals do you keep? Thunder here, plus 2 mares for breeding, half a dozen milk cows, a bull chickens, and a few pigs. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep us fed and provide a little income from selling surplus. Susan nodded, filing away the information. She'd grown up on a ranch, so animal care was familiar territory. What about crops? Small garden for vegetables, and I've cleared enough land for hay and some grain. The soil's not the richest, but it's workable. Are you much of a gardener? I kept my mother's herb garden going after she died, Susan said. Vegetables too, when my father bothered to buy seeds. They fell into comfortable conversation as they rode, discussing practical matters that would soon become part of Susan's daily reality. She found herself relaxing as they talked, appreciating how Noel treated her opinions and questions with respect rather than condescension. By the time they reached Cedar Falls, the sun was fully up and the town was beginning to stir. A few early risers stopped to stare as they passed, clearly recognizing both riders and drawing their own conclusions about what was happening. Judge Morrison's house sat on a tree-lined street near the center of town, a modest but well-maintained structure that spoke of respectability and quiet prosperity. The judge himself answered their knock, already dressed, despite the early hour. "Mr. Boon, Miss May," he said, nodding to each of them in turn. "I must say I'm relieved to see this situation resolving itself in a civilized manner. Please come in." The parlor was warm and inviting, with books lining the walls and comfortable furniture arranged around a crackling fireplace. Mrs. Morrison, a kindly woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, bustled in with a tea service and what appeared to be fresh biscuits. "I took the liberty of asking my wife to serve as witness," Judge Morrison explained, "and I've sent word to Doc Henderson to join us as well, since Mr. Boon requested a medical man be present." "Medical man?" Susan asked, confused. Noel cleared his throat, looking slightly embarrassed. "I wanted to make sure you understood exactly what you're agreeing to. Doc Henderson can explain, well, the physical aspects of marriage, things your mother might have told you if she'd lived." Susan felt her cheeks warm, but she was touched by his consideration. Many men would have simply assumed she knew what to expect or wouldn't have cared whether she was prepared or not. Doc Henderson arrived within minutes, carrying his medical bag and wearing the expression of a man who'd been roused early but wasn't particularly upset about it. After brief greetings, he took Susan aside for a private conversation that was both embarrassing and enlightening. "He's a good man," the doctor said when he'd finished his delicate explanations. "Patient and gentle by nature. You don't need to fear him, my dear." The ceremony itself was simple but dignified. Judge Morrison read from his book of law, explaining the rights and responsibilities of marriage under Colorado territorial law. Susan and Noel exchanged vows that were traditional but heartfelt, promising to honor and cherish each other for as long as they both lived. When Noel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, where had he gotten it so quickly, Susan felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer Susan May, the unwanted daughter. She was Susan Boon, a married woman with a home and a husband who had chosen her deliberately and publicly. "You may kiss your bride," Judge Morrison said with a smile, and Susan held her breath as Noel leaned down to brush his lips gently against hers. It was her first kiss, and though it was brief and chaste, it sent warmth spreading through her entire body. "Mrs. Boon," Noel said softly, and the name sounded wonderful in his deep voice. The legal formalities took another hour, signing documents, arranging for copies to be filed with the territorial authorities, and ensuring that everything was properly recorded. Mrs. Morrison packed them a basket of food for their journey, and Doc Henderson pressed a small bottle of medicinal whiskey into Noel's hands for emergencies. They were preparing to leave when a commotion outside announced the arrival of an unwelcome visitor. Through the parlor window, Susan could see her father's familiar figure stumbling up the front walk, clearly still drunk from the night before and working himself into a rage. "Where is she?" James May bellowed, pounding on the front door. "Where's my daughter? I know she's in there." Judge Morrison sighed and went to answer the door with Noel close behind him. Susan hung back, her newfound confidence wavering at the sound of her father's voice. "Mr. May," the judge said coolly, not inviting the older man inside. "What can I do for you?" "You can return my stolen property," James snarled, swaying slightly as he spoke. "That mountain man kidnapped my daughter." "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Judge Morrison replied calmly. "Mrs. Boon is here of her own free will, having just been married in a ceremony I performed myself. The union is completely legal and binding. Mrs. Boon," James's face turned an alarming shade of purple. "She's my daughter. She can't get married without my permission." "Actually, she can," the judge corrected. "Miss May now. Mrs. Boon is 20 years old and therefore free to make her own marital choices under territorial law." The ceremony was conducted properly with witnesses and all legal requirements met. James tried to push past the judge but found his way blocked by Noel's imposing frame. "You," he spat, pointing an unsteady finger at the mountain man, "you think you can steal from me? I'll have the law on you. The law is right here." Sheriff Coleman's voice cut through the morning air as he approached the house. "And the law says you're disturbing the peace, James May." The sheriff looked tired and irritated, clearly having been roused from his breakfast by reports of the disturbance. "Judge Morrison, is everything in order here?" "Perfectly in order, Sheriff. Mr. and Mrs. Boon were just preparing to depart for their new home when Mr. May arrived, making unfounded accusations." Sheriff Coleman nodded and turned to James with no patience in his expression. "You were told last night that this matter was settled. These young people have been legally married by a territorial judge, which means your daughter is now Mrs. Boon and free to go where she pleases. If you continue to harass them, I'll have to arrest you for disturbing the peace." "This is theft," James protested, but his voice lacked conviction now. "She's worth $50. He owes me money." "The transaction last night was interrupted and declared invalid," Judge Morrison reminded him firmly. "No money was exchanged. No binding agreement was made. Your daughter has simply exercised her legal right to marry the man of her choosing." Through all of this, Susan had remained in the parlor listening to the men argue about her fate as if she were indeed a piece of property. Finally, something inside her snapped. She walked to the front door and stepped outside, facing her father directly for perhaps the first time in her life. "I'm not your property," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I never was. I'm a grown woman who's made her own choice about her future, and that choice doesn't include you." James stared at her as if she were a stranger, and perhaps she was. The cowering, apologetic daughter he'd bullied for 20 years was gone, replaced by someone who stood straight and spoke with confidence. "You'll regret this," he said finally, his voice rough with drink and defeat. "When you're stuck up on that mountain with a scarred old man eating beans and wearing rags, you'll remember what you threw away." "What did I throw away?" Susan asked calmly. "A life of being mocked and belittled, a future of being grateful for scraps of affection." "You're right about one thing, Father. I will remember. I'll remember that I chose dignity over desperation and partnership over pity." James May opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to deflate as the fight went out of him. Without another word, he turned and stumbled away, leaving Susan feeling both triumphant and strangely empty. "Are you all right?" Noel asked quietly, moving to stand beside her. Susan watched her father's retreating figure and felt the last chains of her old life falling away. "I'm fine," she said, and meant it. "I'm ready to go home." The word felt strange on her tongue, home. For the first time in her life, she was going to a place where she truly belonged with someone who actually wanted her there. The journey up the mountain took most of the day, following winding trails that grew progressively steeper and more isolated. Susan had never been this far from Cedar Falls, and she was amazed by the wild beauty of the landscape, towering pines, crystal clear streams, and views that stretched for miles across the valley below. "It's beautiful," she said, during one of their rest stops, and Noel's weather-beaten face creased in what might have been a smile. "It grows on you," he said. "Gets into your blood after a while. I've traveled a fair bit in my time, but I always come back to these mountains." As the afternoon wore on, Susan found herself growing both excited and nervous about seeing her new home. What if it was too primitive? What if she couldn't adapt to such isolation? What if Noel regretted his decision once they were alone together? But when they finally crested the last ridge and the cabin came into view, Susan felt her worries fade. It was larger than she'd expected, built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney and a wide front porch. The setting was magnificent, nestled in a natural clearing, with the mountains rising behind it, and a small meadow stretching out in front, where cattle grazed peacefully. "Welcome home, Mrs. Boon," Noel said, as he helped her down from Thunder's back. Home. The word no longer felt strange. Looking at the solid cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, Susan felt something she'd never experienced before. The bone-deep certainty that she belonged somewhere with someone who truly wanted her there. As they approached the front door, Noel paused with his hand on the latch. "It's not much compared to what you might have had with a different kind of man," he said quietly. Susan looked up at him, this scarred, serious man who had seen something in her worth choosing, and felt her heart swell with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize as love. "It's perfect," she said simply. "It's home." And as Noel pushed open the door to reveal the warm, welcoming interior, beyond, Susan Boon stepped across the threshold into her new life, leaving Susan May and all her old pain behind forever. The interior of the cabin exceeded Susan's expectations in every way. What Noel had described as nothing fancy was actually a testament to skilled craftsmanship and careful planning. The main room was spacious and warm, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that cast dancing shadows across hand-hewn log walls. A sturdy wooden table sat near the kitchen area, which boasted a proper cast-iron stove and shelves lined with preserving jars and cooking implements. "You built all this yourself?" Susan asked, running her fingers along the smooth surface of a pine cabinet that showed evidence of meticulous attention to detail. "Had plenty of time," Noel replied, setting down her carpet bag near the bedroom door. "Winter evenings get long when you're alone. Gave me something to do with my hands, besides drink myself to death." The honesty of the statement caught Susan off guard. She was still learning that Noel had little patience for pretty lies or social niceties. He spoke truth whether it was comfortable or not. The bedroom was smaller but equally well appointed, with a large bed covered in what appeared to be a hand-stitched quilt and a washstand topped with a ceramic basin and pitcher. A small window looked out toward the meadow, and Susan could see cattle moving peacefully across the grass in the fading light. "This will be your room," Noel said quietly. "I'll sleep in the main room until you're ready for other arrangements." The consideration in his voice touched her deeply. How many men would have given thought to her comfort and readiness? How many would have simply assumed their marital rights and taken what they wanted? "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." They spent the evening in careful conversation, sharing the meal Mrs. Morrison had packed and learning the rhythms of each other's presence. Susan discovered that Noel was a good listener who asked thoughtful questions about her life, her interests, her dreams for the future. In return, he shared stories of his time as a cavalry scout, his decision to settle in the mountains, and his gradual transformation from a broken soldier into a man who had found peace in solitude. "Why did you really choose me?" Susan asked as they sat before the fire, the question that had been burning in her mind all day finally breaking free. Noel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I told you part of it," he said finally. your strength, your dignity. But there was something else. He turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. I saw recognition in your face, like you understood what it meant to be looked at and found wanting to be judged for things you couldn't control. I've carried that feeling my whole life, and I saw it in you too. Susan felt her throat tighten with emotion. The scars, among other things. I'm a half-breed Mrs. Boon. My mother was Cheyenne, my father a cavalry officer who abandoned us both when I was 10. Spent my childhood being too Indian for white society and too white for the tribe. Then the war came, and I fought against my mother's people because I was trying to prove I belonged somewhere. Got these scars at Wounded Knee watching women and children die because men like me couldn't figure out where we fit in the world. The pain in his voice was raw and real, and Susan understood suddenly why he had retreated to these mountains. Like her, he had been searching for a place where he could exist without constantly being reminded of how he failed to meet the world's expectations. I'm sorry, she said quietly. That must have been terrible. It was, but it taught me something important, that the people who judge you by what you look like or where you come from aren't worth impressing. The only opinion that matters is your own, and maybe that of someone who loves you for who you are instead of who they think you should be. Love. The word hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Susan felt her heart flutter with something she barely dared to name hope. The days that followed settled into a pattern that felt both strange and wonderfully right. Susan threw herself into making the cabin truly feel like home, reorganizing the kitchen to suit her preferences, mending clothes that had been neglected too long, and adding small touches that softened the masculine austerity of the space. Noel watched her transformation of his solitary domain with what appeared to be quiet amazement. You don't have to change everything, he said one morning as she rearranged the main room to create a more inviting seating area. I'm not changing it, Susan replied, stepping back to admire her work. I'm making it ours. The distinction seemed to please him. That evening he presented her with a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked during his rounds of the property, a small gesture that meant more to Susan than any expensive gift could have. As autumn deepened into winter, Susan discovered that she had a natural aptitude for mountain living. Her experience caring for animals on her father's ranch served her well as she learned to tend Noel's cattle and horses. Her skill with preserving food proved invaluable as they prepared for the harsh months ahead. Most surprisingly, she found that she enjoyed the physical challenges of their lifestyle, the daily chores that built strength in her arms and back, the satisfaction of completing difficult tasks, the sense of genuine partnership that developed as she and Noel worked side by side. You're stronger than you know, Noel told her one evening as they finished mucking out the stable together. Most women from town would have lasted maybe a week up here before demanding to go back. Most women from town haven't spent their lives being told they're too much trouble, Susan replied, wiping sweat from her forehead. This isn't trouble, this is just life. But their peaceful existence was not destined to remain undisturbed. The first sign of trouble came in late October when a rider appeared at their door just as the first serious snow began to fall. Susan recognized him as Pete Hawkins, one of the men who had been in Murphy's saloon the night of her father's auction. Mrs. Boon, he said, touching his hat brim but avoiding her eyes. I need to speak with your husband. Noel emerged from the stable, his expression immediately wary. Hawkins, what brings you up the mountain in weather like this? Railroad business, Pete replied, his nervousness obvious. They sent me to deliver this. He handed over an official-looking document sealed with red wax. Susan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the falling snow as Noel broke the seal and read the document, his face growing darker with each line. What is it? She asked when Pete had departed, clearly relieved to be escaping back down the mountain. They're claiming I'm a squatter, Noel said grimly, handing her the paper. Say this land belongs to the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad under some territorial grant from 15 years ago. Susan read the legal language with growing alarm. The document was formal and intimidating, filled with references to surveys and land grants and territorial law. It gave Noel 30 days to vacate the property or face legal action. "But you've been here for years," she protested. "You built this place yourself. How can they claim it now?" "Easy enough if they've got lawyers and I don't," Noel replied, but Susan could see the worry beneath his calm exterior. Question is whether their claim is legitimate or if they're just trying to steal land that's inconvenient for their plans. The next weeks brought a steady stream of harassment. Railroad surveyors appeared on their property, measuring and marking trees despite Noel's protests. Men in expensive suits rode up from town examining the cabin and outbuildings, like they were already planning its demolition. Most disturbing of all, rumors began circulating in Cedar Falls that Noel was a dangerous squatter who had no legal right to his mountain home. "They're trying to turn the town against us," Susan observed after returning from a supply run where she'd been subjected to cold stares and whispered comments. "Mrs. Patterson actually crossed the street to avoid speaking to me." "Railroads got deep pockets," Noel said grimly. "They can afford to buy a lot of opinions." The situation reached a crisis point in early November when Sheriff Coleman himself made the long ride up to their cabin, accompanied by two railroad officials Susan didn't recognize. The sheriff looked distinctly uncomfortable with his mission, but duty was duty. "Noel," he said heavily, "I've got a warrant here requiring you to appear before Judge Morrison next week. The railroads filed formal papers claiming this land, and the judge has to hear their case." "What kind of case?" Susan demanded, stepping forward. "He's lived here for 6 years. He's improved the land, built a home, raised cattle. Doesn't that count for anything?" One of the railroad men, a thin fellow with shrewd eyes and expensive clothes, spoke up. "Mrs. Boon, I understand your emotional attachment to this property, but the law is quite clear. This land was granted to the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad in 1882 as part of the Territorial Expansion Initiative. Your husband may have occupied it, but occupation without legal title is simply trespassing. That's horseshit, and you know it, Pemberton," Noel said quietly, and Susan realized he knew this man from somewhere. "Language, please," Pemberton replied smoothly. "We're in the presence of a lady. Don't you dare lecture me about ladies." Noel's voice carried a dangerous edge that made even the sheriff step back slightly. "Not when you're trying to steal a woman's home out from under her." Susan felt a surge of fierce pride at hearing Noel defend not just their property, but her specifically. She moved to stand beside him, presenting a united front against the men who threatened everything they'd built together. "What evidence do they have?" she asked Sheriff Coleman. "Surely they need more than just their word to steal someone's land." Coleman looked embarrassed. "They've got surveyors' reports, maps, and what they claim are the original territorial documents. Judge Morrison has to examine everything and make a ruling." After the men left, Susan and Noel sat before their fire and tried to plan their defense. The problem was stark. They had possession and 6 years of improvements, but no formal deed or title to the land. Noel had simply claimed it under frontier tradition, assuming that working the land and building a home gave him squatter's rights. "I should have filed proper papers years ago," he said bitterly. "I just wanted to be left alone, didn't think anyone would care about a patch of mountain that's hard to farm and harder to reach." "You couldn't have known." Susan comforted him, but privately she was terrified. Losing this place would mean losing everything: their home, their livelihood, their carefully built life together. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving them barely a week to prepare. Susan threw herself into research, riding down to town to examine any record she could find in the territorial office. What she discovered was both encouraging and deeply troubling. The railroad's grant was real, she told Noel when she returned from her second day of investigation, but it was specifically for land needed for railroad construction, right-of-way, depot sites, maintenance facilities. This mountain cabin doesn't fit any of those categories. So their claim might not be valid. It might not be, but they've got lawyers who know how to make invalid claims sound convincing, and we've got... Susan gestured helplessly. What do we have? The question haunted them both as the hearing approached. They had right on their side, but right without legal representation was often worthless in territorial courts. Susan had seen enough of frontier justice to know that money and influence carried more weight than fairness. The night before the hearing, as they lay in their bed, Susan had finally moved into the bedroom she shared with Noel, their marriage having grown into something real and deep over the months. She voiced the fear that had been growing in her heart. What if we lose? What if they take everything? Noel's arm tightened around her. Then we'll start over somewhere else. I don't want somewhere else, Susan said fiercely. This is our home. This is where we built our life together. I won't let them steal it without a fight. The vehemence in her voice surprised them both. Susan had never been a fighter before. She'd always been the one who accepted whatever life handed her, who endured rather than resisted. But this place, this man, this life they'd created together was worth fighting for. Then we fight, Noel said simply. Whatever it takes. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and clear, with fresh snow glittering on the mountainsides like scattered diamonds. Susan dressed in her best dress, the blue wool that had been her mother's, and pinned her hair back severely. She wanted to look respectable, responsible, like a woman whose testimony would carry weight with a territorial judge. The ride to town felt both too long and too short, giving them time to rehearse their arguments while building dread for the confrontation ahead. Cedar Falls looked different, somehow more hostile, as if the entire town had already decided against them. The hearing was held in the town hall, a drafty building that served multiple civic functions. Judge Morrison sat behind a wooden desk that had been moved to the front of the room, while perhaps 30 townspeople filled the available chairs and standing space. Susan was surprised and dismayed to see her father among the spectators, his presence adding another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. The railroad was represented by 3 lawyers from Denver, well-dressed men who exuded confidence and competence. They presented their case with professional polish, displaying maps and documents that seemed to support their claim to the disputed land. Your Honor, the lead attorney argued, the territorial grant of 1882 is quite clear. All land within 5 miles of the proposed rail line was granted to the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad for development purposes. Mr. Boon's occupation of this property, however well-intentioned, constitutes illegal trespassing on railroad land. Judge Morrison examined their documents carefully, asking detailed questions about surveys and boundaries. Susan felt her heart sink as the legal case against them was laid out with methodical precision. When it came time for Noel to present his side, he stood slowly and spoke with quiet dignity about his 6 years on the mountain, the improvements he'd made, the life he'd built. But without legal documents to support his claim, his words seemed to carry little weight against the railroad's formal presentation. Mr. Boon, Judge Morrison said when Noel finished, I sympathize with your situation, but the law requires proper documentation of land claims. Do you have any formal filing with the territorial government? Any deed or title papers? No, Your Honor, Noel admitted. I claimed the land under frontier tradition and worked it for 6 years. I thought that gave me rights. The judge sighed. Frontier tradition isn't sufficient under territorial law, I'm afraid. Without proper documentation. Your Honor, Susan stood suddenly, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. May I speak? Judge Morrison looked surprised. Mrs. Boon, while I appreciate your concern, this is a legal proceeding. And I'm a legal party to this proceeding, Susan said firmly. That land is my home too, and I have something to say about these claims. The room fell silent as Susan walked to the front, her blue dress rustling in the quiet. She had no legal training, no formal education beyond what her mother had provided, but she had something the railroad's lawyers lacked: absolute conviction in the righteousness of her cause. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. These railroad men are asking you to believe that they need our mountain cabin for railroad purposes. But I've spent the last week examining their own surveyor's reports, and I found something interesting. She pulled out a hand-drawn map from her reticule, a copy she'd made from documents in the territorial office. According to their own surveys, the proposed rail line runs through the valley more than 8 miles from our cabin. Their grant was specifically for railroad construction purposes, not for claiming any land they happened to want. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Susan saw the railroad lawyers exchange concerned glances. Clearly, they hadn't expected a mountain woman to challenge them on legal technicalities. Furthermore, Susan continued gaining confidence as she spoke. Territorial law provides for squatters' rights when land has been occupied, improved, and worked for more than 5 years. My husband has built a home, cleared fields, raised cattle, and contributed to the local economy for 6 years. Under Territorial Statute 147, that gives him legal claim to the property regardless of other considerations. Judge Morrison looked surprised. Mrs. Boon, are you familiar with Territorial Statute 147? I am now, Your Honor. I spent 3 days reading law books in your own library. Susan's voice carried a note of pride that made Noel's heart swell with admiration. The lead railroad attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, Mrs. Boon's amateur legal research cannot supersede properly filed territorial grants. Perhaps not, Judge Morrison interrupted, but her points about the purpose and scope of the railroad grant are worth examining. Mr. Pemberton, can you explain why your company needs a mountain cabin 8 miles from your proposed rail line? For the first time, the railroad's confident presentation wavered. Pemberton shuffled through his papers, clearly searching for an answer that would satisfy the judge's question. The grant provides for all necessary land for railroad development, he said finally. That includes potential future expansion maintenance facilities and land speculation, Susan interrupted boldly. They don't need our cabin for railroad purposes. They want it because mountain property is becoming valuable, and they think they can steal it using legal technicalities. Mrs. Boon, Judge Morrison said sharply, you will address your remarks to the court, not to the opposing counsel. Yes, Your Honor, I apologize. Susan took a deep breath and played her final card. Your Honor, I have one more document I'd like to present. She reached into her reticule again and pulled out a yellowed paper that had cost her considerable effort to obtain. This is a treaty signed in 1876 between the territorial government and the Cheyenne Nation, establishing boundaries for tribal hunting grounds. According to this treaty, the land in question was specifically reserved for Native American use and could not be granted to railroad companies. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Even Noel looked shocked. Susan hadn't told him about this discovery. Where did you obtain this document? Judge Morrison asked, leaning forward with intense interest. From Elder Nantan of the Southern Cheyenne, Susan replied. He's been keeping tribal records since the treaty was signed, and he confirmed that our land falls within the boundaries established by federal agreement. Pemberton was on his feet again, his composure completely shattered. Your Honor, Mrs. Boon cannot simply produce random documents and expect them to be accepted without authentication. Elder Nantan is prepared to testify to the document's authenticity, Susan said quickly. He's waiting outside if the court wishes to hear from him. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. I believe that would be advisable. Elder Nantan entered the courtroom with quiet dignity, his weathered face impassive as he took in the assembled crowd. He was probably 70 years old, with long gray braids and traditional clothing that marked him as a man who honored the old ways. Many of the townspeople shifted uncomfortably at his presence. Relations between Cedar Falls and the nearby Cheyenne community were cordial but distant. Through careful questioning, Judge Morrison established that the elder had indeed been present at the 1876 treaty signing and had maintained tribal records ever since. The document Susan had produced was authentic, and it did establish Native American rights to the disputed land. Furthermore, Elder Nantan said in his careful English, "I know this man, Noel Boon. His mother was star-walking woman of our people. Under tribal law, he has blood right to this land, regardless of white man's papers." The revelation sent a shock through the courtroom. Noel's mixed heritage had been rumored but never confirmed, and the implications were significant under territorial law. Pemberton made one last desperate attempt to salvage his case. "Your Honor, even if these claims are valid, the railroad grant supersedes all previous agreements." "No, Mr. Pemberton," Judge Morrison said firmly. "Federal treaties supersede territorial grants, and blood rights recognized by tribal law carry weight in territorial courts. Mrs. Boone has presented compelling evidence that your railroad's claim is not only unnecessary for railroad purposes but also legally invalid." The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The railroad's claim was rejected. Noel's squatter's rights were formally recognized, and the land was declared his legal property under multiple statutes. The cabin in the mountains would remain their home. As the crowd dispersed, Susan found herself surrounded by townspeople who seemed to see her with new eyes. The fat May girl had vanished forever, replaced by a woman who had outfought railroad lawyers and saved her family's home through intelligence, determination, and sheer force of will. That was the finest piece of legal reasoning I've seen in 20 years of territorial court, Judge Morrison told her privately. "Have you ever considered studying law formally?" Susan smiled, her arm linked with Noel's, as they prepared to ride home to their mountain. "I think I'll stick to being a mountain wife, Your Honor, but thank you for listening to what I had to say." As they rode up the familiar trail toward their cabin, Susan felt a profound sense of completion. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, her true self. The scared girl who had stood in Murphy's saloon was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and was prepared to fight for what she valued. "I'm proud of you," Noel said quietly as their cabin came into view. "You saved our home today." "We saved it," Susan corrected him. "Together." And as they approached their door, Susan Boone knew that she was finally truly home. The victory in court marked a turning point not just in their legal standing, but in how the community of Cedar Falls viewed the couple who had defied the railroad's power. Word of Susan's brilliant legal maneuvering spread through the territory like wildfire, and within weeks, visitors began making the long journey up the mountain to seek her advice on their own disputes with land speculators and corporate interests. "Mrs. Boone," said Martha Henderson, Doc Henderson's wife, as she sat at their kitchen table one snowy December morning, "you've got to help us. The mining company is trying to claim our water rights, saying they need them for their operations down the valley. Doc says they can't do that, but they've got lawyers just like the railroad did." Susan poured hot coffee into Martha's cup, her mind already working through the legal implications. "Have you filed your water rights with the territorial office?" "Filed them? I didn't know we needed to file anything. We've been using that creek for 15 years, ever since we settled here." This had become a familiar refrain. Many of the original settlers had simply claimed land and water under frontier tradition, never realizing that territorial law required formal documentation. The corporations moving into Colorado territory were exploiting these gaps, using legal technicalities to steal resources from families who had worked the land for decades. "I'll look into it," Susan promised. "But Martha, you need to understand I'm not a lawyer. I can read law books and research precedents, but I can't represent you in court." "You did fine representing yourself," Martha replied firmly. "That's all we're asking, for someone who can figure out what these fancy lawyers are really up to and how to fight back." As winter deepened, their cabin became an unofficial legal aid center for the mountain communities. Farmers, ranchers, miners, and even members of the Cheyenne tribe sought Susan's help in navigating the increasingly complex web of territorial law and corporate manipulation. She found herself spending hours each day poring over legal documents, writing letters to territorial officials, and teaching people how to file the proper paperwork to protect their claims. "You realize what you're becoming, don't you?" Noel observed one evening as Susan worked by lamplight, translating a complex mining contract into plain English for a neighbor. "A busy woman who needs better light to read by," Susan replied, squinting at the small print. "A voice for people who don't have one. A fighter for the underdog." Noel's voice carried both pride and concern. "It's dangerous work taking on the corporations. They don't like losing, and they've got long memories." Susan set down the contract and looked at her husband seriously. "Are you asking me to stop? I'm asking you to be careful. These people you're fighting, they don't play by the same rules we do." The truth of Noel's warning became apparent in early January, when a delegation of well-dressed men arrived at their cabin uninvited. Susan recognized two of them from the railroad hearing Pemberton and another lawyer whose name she didn't know. The third man was new, a stocky fellow with cold eyes and expensive clothes that marked him as someone with serious money and power. "Mrs. Boon," Pemberton said without preamble as Susan opened the door, "we need to have a conversation." "About what?" Susan kept her voice steady, though she could see Noel moving into position behind her, his hand resting casually near the rifle mounted above the fireplace. "About your interference in legitimate business operations," the stocky man said, stepping forward. "I'm Edward Brass, Territorial Representative for the Colorado Development Corporation. We represent several mining, railroad, and land development interests, and your amateur legal meddling is becoming problematic." "Problematic for whom?" Susan asked. "The corporation's trying to steal people's land and water rights." Brass's smile was cold as winter wind. "Mrs. Boon, you seem to labor under the misapprehension that territorial law is some kind of democracy where everyone gets a voice. Let me clarify the situation for you. Colorado territory is being developed by serious investors with serious capital. That development benefits everyone: jobs, infrastructure, prosperity. What doesn't benefit anyone is having some mountain woman playing lawyer and convincing people to fight progress. What I'm doing is helping people understand their rights under the law." Susan replied firmly. "If that interferes with your business operations, perhaps you should examine whether those operations are legal." "Everything we do is perfectly legal." The third man spoke for the first time. "I'm Thomas Wickham, and I represent the Territorial Governor's Office. The governor is quite concerned about the unrest your activities are causing. People are refusing to honor legitimate contracts, filing frivolous legal challenges, and generally disrupting the orderly development of territorial resources." Susan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air flowing through the open door. If the territorial government was involved, this was more serious than corporate harassment. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she asked. "Stop," Brass said bluntly. "Stop giving legal advice you're not qualified to give. Stop filing challenges to properly executed contracts. Stop encouraging people to believe they can fight corporate development with amateur research and territorial statutes." "And if I don't?" Brass exchanged glances with his companions. "Mrs. Boon, you seem like an intelligent woman, intelligent enough to understand that there are consequences for interfering with territorial development. Unfortunate consequences that could affect not just you, but your husband as well." The threat was barely veiled, and Susan saw Noel's jaw tighten dangerously. Before her husband could respond with the violence that was clearly building in him, Susan stepped forward. "Gentlemen," she said with icy politeness, "I appreciate you taking the time to visit our home uninvited and threaten us on our own property. Now, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave before my husband decides he doesn't like your tone." Brass started to respond, but Wickham put a restraining hand on his arm. "We understand each other, Mrs. Boon. I trust you'll give serious consideration to what we've discussed." After they left, Susan and Noel stood in tense silence for several minutes, Finally, Noel spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. They're not going to let this go. Men like that don't make polite suggestions, they make threats and then follow through on them. I know, Susan said quietly, but I can't just stop helping people because some corporate bullies don't like it, even if it puts us both in danger. Susan turned to face her husband, fully seeing the worry and love in his dark eyes. Noel, before I met you, I spent 20 years being the person everyone wanted me to be: quiet, invisible, grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance I could get. I won't go back to that. I won't pretend I don't see injustice just because fighting it makes powerful people uncomfortable. I'm not asking you to be invisible, Noel said, moving to take her hands in his. I'm asking you to be alive. Dead martyrs don't help anyone. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another visitor, Elder Nanton, riding through the falling snow with an urgency that immediately put them both on alert. There is trouble in the valley, the old man said without preamble as Susan welcomed him inside. The mining company has moved equipment onto tribal land, claiming rights they do not possess. Young warriors want to fight, but the tribal council knows this would bring soldiers. We need your help. Susan felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The mining company's encroachment on tribal land was a direct violation of federal treaty, but proving it would require navigating both territorial and federal legal systems. It was exactly the kind of complex case that could either establish important precedents for Native American rights or provoke a violent confrontation that would end in tragedy. What kind of mining equipment? She asked, already reaching for her law books. Steam shovels, ore carts, temporary buildings for workers. They are digging where our ancestors are buried, claiming the federal government sold them mineral rights. Did they show you any documentation, papers with official seals, but written in the white man's legal language that few of our people can read? Susan nodded grimly. This was a common tactic, using complex legal documents to convince people they had no choice but to accept corporate encroachment. Often the documents were legitimate but misrepresented. Sometimes they were complete fabrications. I'll need to see those papers, she said, and I'll need to research the original treaty terms and any subsequent federal legislation affecting mineral rights on tribal land. Elder Nanton's weathered face showed relief. The tribal council will be grateful for your help. There's something you should know, Susan said carefully. I've been threatened by corporate representatives who want me to stop helping people fight these land grabs. Taking on this case could put me in more danger. And us as well, Noel added pointedly. The elder was quiet for a moment, considering this information. My people have faced danger from white corporations for many years, he said finally. But we have learned that sometimes the greatest danger comes from doing nothing. If we do not fight for our rights under white man's law, we will lose everything to white man's greed. That evening, as Susan spread tribal treaties and federal mining laws across their kitchen table, she felt the full weight of the choice before her. She could step back, accept the threats, and return to the quiet life she and Noel had built together. Or she could continue down a path that was becoming increasingly dangerous, but might help protect not just individual families but entire communities from corporate exploitation. What do you think? She asked Noel, as he sat down across from her with his own cup of coffee. I think, he said slowly, that I married a woman who can't ignore injustice any more than she can ignore a crying baby. I think trying to ask you to stop fighting for what's right would be like asking you to stop breathing, and the danger, we'll face that when it comes. But Susan, if we're going to take on the mining companies and the territorial government, we can't do it alone. We need allies, people with more resources and legal standing than a mountain couple with law books and good intentions. Susan nodded thoughtfully. Judge Morrison has been sympathetic, and Sheriff Coleman seemed genuinely troubled by the corporate threats. What about your sisters? Margaret's educated, Patricia's got connections through her church work. They might be able to help. The suggestion surprised Susan. She'd had little contact with her sisters since the wedding, partly due to the distance and difficulty of mountain travel, partly because she'd assumed they disapproved of her choice to marry Noel. "I don't know if they'd want to get involved," she said uncertainly. "There's only one way to find out." The next morning brought Margaret herself riding up the mountain path with a determination that reminded Susan powerfully of their mother. She was bundled against the cold, but sat her horse with the same pride that had carried her through their father's auction night. "Susan," she said as she dismounted, "we need to talk." Over hot coffee and fresh bread, Margaret revealed that word of Susan's legal work had reached the sisters in town, along with rumors about corporate threats and pressure from territorial officials. "We've been hearing things," Margaret said carefully. "People saying you're stirring up trouble fighting battles that can't be won, but we've also been hearing from families you've helped people who got to keep their land and water rights because you taught them how to fight back." "What's your point?" Susan asked, though she could guess where this conversation was heading. "My point is that you're not the only one who's tired of being pushed around. Patricia's been working with the church to help immigrant families who are being cheated by labor contractors. Catherine's been teaching at the schoolhouse and seeing how the mining companies treat their workers' children. Mary's been helping Doc Henderson with families who can't pay for medical care because the corporations are paying starvation wages." Margaret paused, taking a sip of coffee before continuing. "We've all been fighting our own little battles, trying to help where we can, but you're the only one who's figured out how to fight back legally, how to use their own laws against them. What are you asking? Help us organize. Teach us what you've learned. Show us how to file the right papers, how to research legal precedents, how to challenge corporate contracts. We can't all be lawyers, but we can all learn to read the law and help our neighbors understand their rights." The proposal was both exciting and terrifying. Creating a network of legally informed citizens who could challenge corporate exploitation would be incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous. "Margaret," Susan said slowly, "the territorial government is involved now. They're not just threatening me anymore, they're threatening anyone who interferes with corporate development. If you get involved in this, you could lose everything." "What everything?" Margaret asked with bitter laughter. "Our father's ranch is mortgaged to the bank. The bank is owned by mining interests, and we're all working for wages that barely keep us fed. What exactly do we have to lose that hasn't already been stolen from us?" The truth of Margaret's words hit Susan like a physical blow. The corporate exploitation wasn't limited to land grabs and water rights. It extended to every aspect of territorial life, from wages to prices to basic services. The May sisters, like most working families, were already trapped in a system designed to extract maximum profit from their labor while giving them minimum compensation. "There's something else," Margaret continued. "Father's been talking to railroad representatives again. They're offering him money to testify that your marriage to Noel was coerced, that you were forced into it against your will." Susan felt the blood drain from her face. "What? They want to invalidate your marriage, legally claim that any property rights you gained through it are fraudulent. They think if they can destroy your legal standing, they can also destroy your credibility as someone who challenges their contracts." The implications were staggering. If her marriage was declared invalid, Susan would lose not just her home, but her legal identity as a married woman. Under territorial law, unmarried women had severely limited rights to own property, sign contracts, or represent themselves in legal proceedings. "What did Father say?" Susan asked, though she dreaded the answer. "He's considering it. The railroad is offering enough money to clear his debts and save the ranch. He's desperate enough to do almost anything." Noel, who had been listening grimly to this conversation, finally spoke. "Let him try. I've got witnesses to our wedding, including Judge Morrison himself. Any court in the territory would laugh at a claim that our marriage was coerced." "Would they?" Margaret asked pointedly. If the territorial government wants your marriage invalidated, and if they've got corporate money backing them up, do you really think territorial courts will stand up to that pressure? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. They all knew the answer, even if none of them wanted to say it out loud. "So what do we do?" Susan asked finally. "We fight," Margaret said simply, "all of us together. We organize every family in the territory who's being cheated or threatened. We research every law, every precedent, every legal protection that exists. We file so many challenges and complaints that the territorial government can't ignore us anymore. And when they arrest us for sedition or disrupting territorial development, then we make sure the federal government knows what's happening here. We write to newspapers in Denver and Colorado Springs and even back east. We document every illegal corporate action, every corrupt territorial official, every violation of federal law or treaty. We make it too expensive and too public for them to keep stealing from us." It was an ambitious plan, perhaps impossibly so. But as Susan looked at her sister's determined face, she realized that Margaret was right about one thing. They had already lost so much to corporate greed that they had little left to lose by fighting back. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, reaching into her coat to pull out a letter. "This came for you through the territorial post office from Washington, D.C. Susan took the letter with trembling hands, recognizing the official seal of the federal government. Inside was a formal communication from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, requesting her assistance in investigating complaints about violations of federal treaties in Colorado Territory. "They want me to serve as a liaison between tribal communities and federal investigators," Susan said after reading the letter twice. "They're offering to pay for my time and provide legal resources for researching treaty violations." "The federal government wants to hire you?" Noel asked, his voice filled with amazement. "It looks that way. Apparently word of our victory against the railroad reached Washington, and there are federal officials who are very interested in corporate violations of Indian treaties." Margaret smiled for the first time since arriving. "So you wouldn't just be some mountain woman playing lawyer anymore. You'd be a federal agent with official authority to investigate corporate crimes." The irony was delicious. The same corporations that had tried to intimidate Susan into silence had inadvertently drawn federal attention to their illegal activities. Now the government wanted her help in building cases against them. "What do you think?" Susan asked Noel. "I think," her husband said slowly, "that you've found your calling. And I think these corporate bullies are about to discover they picked the wrong woman to threaten." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. This time it wasn't corporate representatives or tribal elders. It was Sheriff Coleman, accompanied by a man Susan didn't recognize, but whose bearing suggested federal authority. "Mrs. Boon," Sheriff Coleman said as they answered his knock, "I'd like you to meet Special Agent Harrison from the Justice Department. He's here to discuss some federal matters that I think will interest you greatly." Agent Harrison was a tall, thin man with intelligent eyes and the kind of quiet competence that suggested he was very good at his job. He declined coffee but accepted their invitation to sit at the kitchen table, spreading out his own collection of official documents. "Mrs. Boon," he said without preamble, "the federal government has been receiving complaints about systematic violations of federal law in Colorado Territory. Treaty violations, mail fraud, illegal use of federal land grants, and possible corruption of territorial officials. Your name has come up repeatedly as someone who understands both the legal issues and the local situation." "I'm flattered," Susan said carefully, "but I'm not sure what help I can provide." "More than you might think. We need someone who can investigate these complaints, gather evidence, and work with affected communities to build federal cases. Someone who understands the law but also has the trust of the people being victimized." Agent Harrison pulled out a commission document bearing federal seals and signatures. "Mrs. Boon, I'm authorized to offer you an appointment as a special investigator for the Justice Department with full federal authority to investigate violations of federal law in Colorado Territory." Susan stared at the document, hardly believing what she was seeing. 6 months ago, she had been the fat May girl that no one wanted. Now, the federal government was offering her a law enforcement position with real authority to fight the corruption that had been plaguing the territory. What would this involve exactly? She asked. Investigating complaints, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, researching legal precedents, and preparing cases for federal prosecution. You'd work with tribal communities, immigrant families, small farmers, anyone who's being victimized by corporate crimes that fall under federal jurisdiction. And the pay? $50 a month plus expenses for travel and research. Not a fortune, but enough to support yourself while doing this work. It was more money than Susan had ever dreamed of earning, and for doing work that felt like a sacred calling rather than just a job. There's one condition, Agent Harrison continued. This work is dangerous. The people you'd be investigating have significant power and resources, and they won't hesitate to retaliate against federal agents who threaten their operations. You'd need to be prepared for that. Susan looked around the table at the faces of her husband and sister, seeing support and determination in their expressions. Then she looked back at Agent Harrison and made the decision that would define the rest of her life. Agent Harrison, she said firmly, I accept your offer. The transformation was immediate and profound. Within hours of accepting her federal appointment, Susan felt the change in how people treated her. The corporate representatives who had threatened her just days before now found themselves the subjects of federal investigation. The territorial officials who had tried to intimidate her now faced scrutiny from Washington. The families and communities she had been helping now had a powerful advocate with real legal authority. But with power came new responsibilities and new dangers. As word of her appointment spread through the territory, Susan realized that she had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. She was no longer just a mountain woman helping her neighbors. She was a federal agent taking on some of the most powerful interests in the American West. The war was far from over, but for the first time, Susan Boon felt like she had the weapons to fight it. The federal badge felt heavier than its actual weight as Susan pinned it to her coat that first morning as special investigator. Agent Harrison had departed after providing her with a stack of complaint files, official letterheads, and detailed instructions on federal investigative procedures. Now she sat at her kitchen table, transformed from mountain housewife to federal law enforcement officer with the stroke of a pen. You realize everything's different now, Noel said as he watched her organize the complaint files by priority and jurisdiction. Once you start making federal cases against these people, there's no going back to our quiet life. Was it ever really quiet? Susan asked, looking up from a particularly damning report about mining companies dumping arsenic into streams that fed tribal water supplies. Even before this appointment, we were fighting for our home, helping our neighbors, standing up to corporate bullies. The only difference now is that I have the authority to do something meaningful about it. The first case Agent Harrison had assigned her proved both the power and the danger of her new position. The Consolidated Mining Corporation had been systematically cheating Cheyenne workers out of wages, paying them in company scrip that could only be used at company stores where prices were inflated beyond reason. When the workers complained, they were fired and evicted from company housing. When tribal leaders protested, they were threatened with arrest for trespassing on mining property. Susan's investigation began with a ride to the mining camp, a sprawling collection of ramshackle buildings and industrial equipment that scarred the landscape like an infected wound. The contrast between the workers' squalid quarters and the comfortable offices of the mining supervisors told the story more clearly than any legal document could. Mrs. Boon, said Joseph Crow Feather, a young Cheyenne man who had agreed to serve as her guide and translator, the miners are afraid to talk to federal agents. They think it will make their situation worse. What would make them willing to talk? Proof that someone in authority actually cares about justice, not just keeping the peace. Susan spent 3 days at the mining camp listening to stories that grew more horrifying with each telling. Workers injured in unsafe conditions were denied medical care unless they signed documents absolving the company of responsibility. Families were charged rent for shacks that lacked basic sanitation, then charged again for the privilege of shopping at the only store that would accept their company scrip. Children were denied schooling because the company claimed they were temporary residents with no right to territorial services. The legal violations were numerous and clear-cut. The use of company scrip in place of legal tender violated federal banking laws. The denial of medical care to injured workers violated federal workplace safety regulations. The exclusion of children from territorial schools violated federal civil rights protections. Most damning of all, the systematic underpayment of Native American workers violated multiple federal treaties governing tribal labor rights. But documenting the violations was only the beginning. Building a federal case required evidence that would stand up in court, witness testimony that wouldn't be dismissed as unreliable, and legal arguments that couldn't be overturned on technical grounds. The key is the company records, Susan explained to Joseph as they prepared to confront the mining supervisors. If I can get access to their books, their payroll records, their housing contracts, I can prove systematic fraud that goes far beyond simple workplace disputes. And if they refuse to provide those records, then I use my federal authority to compel them. That's what this badge means. They can't just ignore me or threaten me anymore. The confrontation came when Susan presented herself at the mining company's main office, a substantial building that served as headquarters for their territorial operations. The supervisor, a florid man named Davidson, who clearly wasn't used to being challenged by anyone, much less a woman, initially tried to dismiss her with bureaucratic double-talk. "Mrs. Boon, I understand you've been talking to some of our workers, but you have to understand that mining operations are complex businesses with specialized requirements." "Mr. Davidson," Susan interrupted, placing her federal commission on his desk. "I'm here as a special investigator for the United States Justice Department, investigating violations of federal law. I need to examine your payroll records, housing contracts, and medical care policies immediately." Davidson's face went through several shades of red as he read the official document. "This is highly irregular. We can't simply turn over confidential business records to every person who claims federal authority." "Would you prefer to explain your reluctance to a federal judge?" Susan asked calmly. "Because obstruction of a federal investigation is a serious crime, and I'm prepared to file charges if you continue to refuse cooperation." The threat had its intended effect. Within an hour, Susan was examining records that documented years of systematic exploitation. The payroll books showed Native American workers being paid half the wages of white workers for identical jobs. The housing contracts charged families 3 times the fair market rate for substandard accommodations. The medical records showed a pattern of denying care to injured workers while billing them for services never provided. "This is enough evidence to shut down their entire operation," Susan told Joseph as they reviewed the copied documents that evening. "Federal prosecutors will have a field day with this." But building the case proved more complex than simply documenting corporate crimes. The company's lawyers immediately challenged Susan's authority, filing motions claiming that a woman couldn't serve as a federal investigator and that her appointment was invalid under territorial law. When those challenges failed, they attacked her credibility, spreading rumors about her marriage and suggesting that her personal relationships compromised her professional judgment. The personal attacks reached a crescendo when James May appeared at her cabin one evening, clearly drunk and carrying a document that he waved threateningly in her face. "You think you're so high and mighty now," he slurred, swaying dangerously as he stood on their front porch. "Federal investigator saving the poor Indians fighting the big corporations. but you're still just my fat daughter who nobody wanted until some desperate mountain man took pity on you." "What do you want, Father?" Susan asked, keeping her voice level despite the familiar pain his words caused. "I want you to stop embarrassing this family with your ridiculous crusade. And if you won't stop voluntarily, I've got papers here that will force you to stop." He thrust the document toward her, and Susan saw immediately what it was: a sworn affidavit claiming that her marriage to Noel had been coerced and was therefore invalid under territorial law. "The railroad's lawyers paid me good money for this testimony," James continued. "They're filing it with the territorial court tomorrow, asking for your marriage to be annulled and your federal appointment to be revoked." Noel stepped out of the cabin behind Susan, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the confrontation. "I think you'd better leave, James. This doesn't concern you, half-breed. This is family business. Susan is my family now. You stopped being her family the night you tried to sell her like livestock." James's face twisted with rage and alcohol-fueled courage. "She's still my daughter, and I say she comes home where she belongs, instead of playing federal agent and causing trouble for decent business people." "No," Susan said quietly, but with absolute finality. "I'm not your daughter anymore. I haven't been since the night you proved you cared more about money than family. File your affidavit, spread your lies, take the railroad's money. It won't change anything except how much respect you have left in this community." James stared at her for a long moment, perhaps seeing clearly for the first time the transformation his daughter had undergone. The frightened, submissive girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had found her strength and refused to apologize for using it. "You'll regret this," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "The only thing I regret is that it took me 20 years to realize I didn't need your approval to be worth something." After James left, Susan and Noel sat together on their porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains they both loved. The affidavit was a serious threat. If James's testimony was accepted by a territorial court, it could indeed invalidate their marriage and potentially compromise Susan's federal authority. "Are you worried?" Noel asked. "About the legal challenge?" "Not really. Judge Morrison performed our ceremony, and he's not likely to be intimidated by railroad lawyers. About what this means for us personally, that's different." "What do you mean?" Susan leaned against her husband's solid presence, drawing comfort from his unwavering support. "I mean that fighting these battles is going to get harder before it gets easier. The corporations aren't just going to accept defeat gracefully. They're going to attack us personally, professionally, and legally. They'll try to destroy our reputation, our marriage, our livelihood, anything they can think of to stop us from interfering with their profits. Do you want to stop?" The question hung in the evening air like the smoke from their chimney. Susan considered it seriously, weighing the costs and benefits of continuing her fight against corporate corruption. "I can't stop," she said finally. "Not because of federal authority or legal obligations, but because of what I've seen. Those families at the mining camp living in conditions that would shame a civilized society. The tribal members being cheated out of wages and water rights. The immigrant families being exploited by labor contractors. How do I turn my back on that just because fighting it makes my life more difficult?" "You don't," Noel said simply. "That's not who you are." The legal challenge to their marriage was heard the following week in a courtroom packed with townspeople curious to see how the drama would unfold. James May testified with obvious reluctance his story about coercion so clearly rehearsed and unconvincing that even the railroad's lawyers seemed embarrassed by it. Judge Morrison's response was swift and decisive. "Mr. May, I performed the marriage ceremony myself, and I can testify that Mrs. Boon participated willingly and enthusiastically. Your claims of coercion are not only unfounded, but insulting to the intelligence of this court. The marriage stands as legally valid, and any attempt to challenge Mrs. Boon's federal authority based on marital status is hereby dismissed. But the victory in court was overshadowed by escalating harassment from corporate interests. Susan's horse was found with a cut saddle strap that could have caused a serious fall. Their cabin was vandalized while they were away with threatening messages painted on the walls. Most disturbing of all, someone had been asking detailed questions about their daily routines, the location of their property boundaries, and the security of their home. "They're planning something," Noel said grimly, as they surveyed the damage to their front door. "This isn't random harassment anymore, it's reconnaissance." "Planning what?" "I don't know, but I think we need help." Help came from an unexpected source. Margaret arrived the next morning accompanied by Sheriff Coleman, Doc Henderson, and a group of about 20 townspeople who had benefited from Susan's legal assistance. "We've been talking," Margaret announced without preamble, "and we've decided that we're not going to let corporate bullies intimidate a federal officer who's trying to protect our community." Sheriff Coleman nodded gravely. "I can't provide official protection without evidence of specific threats, but I can organize a volunteer watch system to keep an eye on your property. And I can provide medical assistance if there are any incidents," Doc Henderson added. The show of community support was overwhelming and deeply moving. These were people who had their own problems, their own struggles with corporate exploitation, but they were willing to put themselves at risk to protect someone who had stood up for them. "There's something else," Margaret said, pulling Susan aside for a private conversation. "Patricia's been working with the territorial newspaper, and she's written an article about your federal investigation into mining company fraud. They're planning to publish it tomorrow. An article about the investigation, Margaret, that could compromise the entire case. Not about the legal details, about the human story, the families being exploited, the workers being cheated, the community coming together to support federal law enforcement. Patricia's very careful not to reveal anything that could hurt your investigation, but she wants people to understand what's really happening here." The article, when it appeared, was a masterpiece of human interest journalism that somehow managed to be both heartbreaking and inspiring. Patricia had interviewed families affected by corporate exploitation, documenting their struggles without revealing their identities or compromising ongoing investigations. She had painted Susan not as a crusading federal agent, but as a neighbor who had learned to fight back against injustice and was teaching others to do the same. The response was immediate and powerful. Letters of support arrived from across the territory, along with new complaints about corporate crimes and offers of assistance from lawyers, journalists, and federal officials. Most importantly, the article had put a human face on issues that corporations preferred to keep abstract and legal. But it also escalated the conflict to a new level. Within days of the article's publication, Susan received a visit from a well-dressed man who introduced himself as Marcus Webb, representing what he called consolidated territorial business interests. "Mrs. Boon," Webb said as they sat in her parlor, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of territorial development and your role in it." "I don't think there's any misunderstanding," Susan replied calmly. "I investigate violations of federal law. When territorial businesses violate those laws, I build cases for federal prosecution. It's quite straightforward, but perhaps unnecessarily adversarial. The businesses you're investigating provide jobs, infrastructure, and economic development that benefit everyone in the territory. Surely there's a way to address any concerns without resorting to federal prosecution that could damage the entire territorial economy." Susan studied Webb carefully, recognizing the sophisticated approach he was taking. Unlike previous corporate representatives who had relied on threats and intimidation, Webb was trying to appeal to her sense of community responsibility. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A partnership. The business community establishes a fund for community improvements, better schools, medical facilities, infrastructure development. Your federal investigation is quietly closed with findings that any previous problems have been resolved through voluntary corporate compliance. Everyone benefits, no one gets hurt." except the workers who continue to be exploited, the families who continue to be cheated, and the communities who continue to be poisoned by industrial waste. Webb's smile never wavered. Mrs. Boon, idealism is admirable, but pragmatism is more effective. You can continue your federal investigation and spend years in court battles that may or may not succeed, or you can accept a solution that provides immediate benefits to the community. How much money are we talking about? $50,000 initially, with ongoing contributions based on territorial business profits. It could fund significant improvements to territorial services. The offer was substantial, more money than most territorial communities ever saw for public improvements. It was also a clear attempt at bribery, though couched in language that made it sound like community development. "Mr. Webb," Susan said finally, "I appreciate you taking the time to present this offer, but I'm not interested in partnerships that require me to ignore federal crimes. My job is to investigate violations of federal law and build cases for prosecution. That's what I intend to do." Webb's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Boon, I hope you'll reconsider. The territorial business community has significant resources and influence. It would be unfortunate if your federal investigation were to encounter obstacles that could have been avoided through cooperation." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Webb?" "I'm simply observing that federal investigations depend on local cooperation, territorial court systems, and community support, all of which can be influenced by business interests when necessary." After Webb left, Susan sat in her parlor, feeling the full weight of the forces arrayed against her. The corporations weren't just wealthy and powerful, they were organized, sophisticated, and willing to use every tool at their disposal to protect their interests. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated not just Susan's determination, but the depth of community support for her work and the federal government's commitment to enforcing its laws in territorial communities. That evening, as Susan worked on her case files by lamplight, she received a telegram that changed everything. It was from Agent Harrison in Washington, and its message was brief but electrifying. "Additional federal investigators arriving next week. Congressional committee authorizing full territorial investigation. Corporate fraud cases now federal priority. Well done." The war was far from over, but the federal government had decided to send reinforcements. Susan's solitary battle against corporate corruption was about to become a coordinated federal campaign with resources and authority that even the most powerful territorial businesses couldn't ignore. As winter began to give way to spring, Susan stood on her porch and looked out over the mountains that had become her true home. 6 months ago, she had been the unwanted daughter that nobody chose. Now she was a federal investigator whose work was reshaping territorial law enforcement and corporate accountability. The transformation was so complete that sometimes she barely recognized the frightened girl who had once stood in Murphy's saloon grateful for any scrap of attention or affection. That girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had found her strength, her purpose, and her voice. "Any regrets?" Noel asked, joining her on the porch as the sun set behind the peaks. Susan considered the question seriously. The path she had chosen was dangerous and difficult, filled with threats and challenges that would only grow more intense as federal pressure on territorial corporations increased. But it was also meaningful in ways that her old life had never been. "None," she said, finally leaning into her husband's embrace. "Not one." Tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges, new attempts by powerful interests to silence the woman who had dared to challenge their authority. But tonight, Susan Boon stood in the doorway of the home she had helped save, surrounded by the community she had helped protect, secure in the love of the man who had chosen her, not in spite of who she was, but because of it. The fat one that nobody had wanted had become the woman everyone needed, and she was just getting started.